Hello and welcome back to my healing journey. I left off reading Born in Captivity in the introduction. And so I'm going to pick up where we left off and continue to read and become enlightened myself. And I hope in my reading it will inspire you to dig deep within yourself and do whatever work needs to be done to repair yourself and possibly even your family members. So, page 14. While the person suffering from psychoneurosis displays behavior that is often contradictory and unreasonable, and they live a life that is highly dependent upon an external culture that is innately hostile toward them, their cognitive distortions, which are guarded by cognitive dissonance, convince them that they are right in their behavior and they will defend that behavior at all cost. Because they see blacks who look to free themselves from the oppression of the system as enemies, and they have no true sense of affinity with other blacks on any relevant level. They have no problem taking action to thwart any efforts to achieve black autonomy. In their mind, black autonomy is dangerous because it dismisses the postulation that we need white people in order to thrive. Autonomy for the person struggling with psychoneurosis is a dangerous concept that would cause them to have to completely readjust their thinking and abandon their goal of social assimilation into the white culture. At the very depths of this dilemma, the person suffering from psychoneurosis harbors a self-hatred that is anchored in the frustration associated with the fact that they will never obtain the status of being white, and so they are left with the only other option, to be accepted and validated by whites. While it could be easy to dismiss this behavior as being a part of a mental disorder, I would suggest that you conduct your own research and evaluate the perpetual behavior of most blacks. While we are most 150 years removed from slavery, we are only 50 years removed from traditional Jim Crow, and based on Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, currently in the middle of a contemporary version of Jim Crow. Not only has the trauma associated with the black experience continued in America, but blacks never properly engaged the traumatic scars associated with slavery and Jim Crow. Ask yourself this question. If a U.S. Marine or U.S. soldier is required to be treated for post-traumatic stress disorder after only 6 to 9 months in hostile war conditions, how much treatment would a group of people who have experienced centuries of trauma and hostility need to effectively engage the real issues created by that trauma? Inferiority complexes and self-hatred birthed during these eras don't simply disappear because you call a young black male a prince or a young black female a princess, especially when they are constantly surrounded by images of inferiority. In addition to studying the complex nature of psychoneurosis, there were many other psychopathological behaviors that concerned me, especially those behaviors that were counterproductive, counterintuitive, and literally antagonistic to our socioeconomic fluidity and overall empowerment. During the 1960s, the world of psychology experienced a significant shift in paradigms as far as treatment methodologies are concerned. At a time in which psychodynamic theory was monolithic and psychoanalysis was the predominant method of treatment, Aaron T. Beck introduced his cognitive theory, which focused on The power of cognitive distortions to influence perceptive reality in patients who were suffering from mental disorders, especially as it pertains to depression. While the theory of cognitive dissonance preceded Beck's cognitive theory by more than a decade, it was Beck who made the connection between erroneous and ill-advised behavior and distorted cognitions. Through my own work, I propose that the negative cognitive distortions of African Americans, the unit of analysis in my studies, which originate from several systematic influences, with the most prevalent being the intergenerational transmission of trauma, sets up a dynamic process that includes an increase in interpersonal and structural violence, an inability to react in a timely fashion to patterns of threat or opportunity, and a cycle of fragmentation because of the first two. I present the collective cognitive bias reality syndrome theory as the explanation for these behavioral phenomena. I further propose that it is cognitive distortions that negatively impact the social mobility and functionality of African Americans in key areas such as economic unity, education, family structure, etc. Through establishing the direct connection between thoughts and behavioral patterns in humans, the behaviors of African Americans that can be attributed to its lack of collective mobility and basic functionality were assessed to determine their source. The method used to evaluate and develop my proposed hypothesis was primarily exploratory, inductive, consisting of the evaluation of extant empirical data and the clinical and social observation of contemporary African Americans, while comparing contemporary behaviors in juxtaposition to behaviors from previous generations to measure certain unidimensional and multidimensional constructs that explain certain abstract phenomena. Ultimately, my theory suggests that poor mobility and dysfunctionality is the result of an erroneous belief system sustained by cognitive distortions that serve to underwrite the perpetual cycle of destructive behavior that leads to perpetual dysfunction. I propose that these distortions have four primary origins: white supremacy racism, as it is defined here, the cyclical perpetuation of distorted views stemming from the American slavery experience, continued subsequent trauma, re-injury, and the impact of untreated intergenerational trauma. Additionally, during my research, intergenerational trauma and the numerous mediums through which it is transmitted was determined to be a constant element of influence in the dysfunctionality and erroneous behavior of African Americans. I assert that addressing the cognitive distortions of African American collective through systematic mechanisms that possess the capacity to positively impact their cognitive process. The positive thought process will inherently produce behavior that will be conducive to improving the mobility and functionality among the collective group in ways that can be effectively measured, monitored, and adjusted. Additionally, I examined the origin of these cognitive distortions while submitting a scientific-based solution that can be effectively implemented and executed. My work addresses the plight of the African American people and the definitive role of negative or biased cognitions on the social mobility and overall mental health of this group. For the purpose of lucidity, it is paramount to ensure that there is a clear understanding of the term African American when considering the group as a unit of analysis within the scope of this exploratory examination. The diversity of the African diaspora makes identifying a specific subgroup, such as African Americans, a daunting task. While one could argue that every American is an African American based on the scientific data that confirms that all of humanity descended from and can be traced back to East Central Africa, the use of such a holistic and inclusive perspective that is grounded in the history of humankind and the transmission of cultural ethos would be considered immensely uncommon in Western culture and in the realm of Western thought as it pertains to the science of psychology and most Western psychological models. While my research practices and approach to psychology is not confined by Eurocentric paradigms and constructs, I do agree that a strong distinction must be made here. The monocultural hegemony of a Western dichotomous logic serves to partition humanity into convenient subgroups that are definable primarily based on external appearances, with the culture often using these superficial micro variations to foster generalizations about each group. One of the multitudinous cultural and political mechanisms through which the complex dynamic of cognitive fragmentation, cognitive biases, and cognitive distortions became an influential variable of frustration and regressive behavior. These ethnic generalizations are a significant part of the dynamic that victimizes African Americans specifically. When referring to African Americans in this body of work, it is necessary that we acknowledge the cultural tendencies in emphasizing the subgroup and race of people, taking a more holistic and congruent approach in defining African Americans as those who have an identifiable connection to the slavery experience, while sharing physiological, spiritual, and historical connections to the continent of Africa, influencing a highly complex constellation of values, mores, tradition, customs, practices, and cultural paradigms that heavily influence their perspective of their reality in America, subsequently shaping the manner in which they respond to their circumstances. It is important to point out that among this group of African Americans, there will be some who will enthusiastically identify with the continent of Africa, and there will be others who will vigorously fight to distance themselves from any association with Africa, with both being influenced by the cognitions that form their cultural paradigms. Based on the complex nature of overlapping social paradigms, the presence of certain ontological ambiguities presented epistemological challenges that had to be worked out as data was collected and analyzed. The uniqueness of the African American experience also impacted the epistemology. Additionally, this same complex construct required that I adopt an investigative approach that embraced the principles of functionalism in certain aspects of the research and interpretivism in others. I am actually going to stop there because I just want to reflect back on what I just read, and not only what I just read, but in the previous pages that I read that spoke about it being dangerous to just to reiterate, the person that is suffering from psychoneurosis is so dangerous because they have no desire to be awakened. They see the system as their savior. They have experienced or created a certain pseudo-reality that convinces them of their comfort, which is non-existent. They see blacks who refuse to assimilate or bow down as the enemy of their peace or perceived progress. This paragraph brings Oprah Winfrey to mind. She has, assimilated into the dominant culture in society, and at any given moment, she will sell out her fellow African Americans at a price. So she would be one that I would think of as for psychoneurosis is concerned. The next thought that occurred to me in my reading today was it spoke about like generations and things that are basically passed down through generations, mindsets, things of that nature. And so I believe that I see that in my own life.